So one of the interesting things about our conversation is you, right? Because in so many ways, people would look at you and assume that you're not who you are when it comes to sports and football. That as a woman of color, as a young woman of color, as a person who people wouldn't necessarily associate as one who writes about sports, who's gone on MSNBC and on public radio and all these places and talked about sports in a pretty deep and knowledgeable way, would just look at you and be like, no, what is who is she talking about, like Fashion Week, right? But no, quite the opposite. So how do you come to your passion in sports?
So I think I come to the passion in two ways. Like all good things in my life, my grandmother, I think, is responsible for my love of sports. Growing up, one of my biggest memories was going to her house, and she would always be watching something. She would always be watching sports. So she would be watching either a 49ers game or she would watch golf. And so she was this really, really passionate sports fan.
Because you're all from the Bay Area, so she was into all
She was into all the Bay Area sports. And she was sort of a rebel for her time, right? Like, she never really got married. She was always, like, kind of just, like, on her own tip, like, not trying to go to church, not trying to be anybody's, like, traditional black woman. And also, I grew up and I was kind of a tomboy. But I was, like, what I like to call, like, sort of a physically inept tomboy. So like I grew up and I was kind of
you were
like
kind of between fall out of it or something, or?
Sort of. I mean, I was athletic, but actually, so I grew up. I had really, really bad asthma, and so my mom and my grandmother never let me play sports. And so the only opportunity I had to engage with sports was by watching them or reading about.
Because you have the desire and the inclination, but because of health concern, you couldn't play.
Right. So I didn't actually start playing sports until middle school, but I remember like being in sixth grade and being afraid to tell my grandmother and my mother that I wanted to try out for the basketball team. So what I did was I went to the library and I got a book on basketball and I read all about basketball and like the history of it and all this, so that my pitch to them could be informed. And that they could know that this was something that I was really passionate about and wanted to do. And it worked. It worked.
And what is it about you though? I mean, that moved you from being like a fan and someone who has all these touchstones. Like, I love sports because it's about memories and it's about family and it's about connection. That's true for a lot of people. But how did it send you into like a deep dive on like stats and like you're looking at the stats for each game and you're watching it? You know what I mean?
I mean, I think I'm really obsessed with stories, right? And I feel like when you can build sort of narratives of stories, right? Like I really like the whole Nick Silver thing, right? Or Nate Silver like wanting to basically predict the future and like look at it. Like you feel a little bit of control when you can actually look at something and be like, okay, statistically this should happen.
So then how, I mean, given all these touchstones that you have in your life, right? Given the fact that you are a person of color, you're a woman, you're a lesbian, all the rest of it, and there's been this contact with this sport, football, as we were talking about, that's deeply problematic in so many of those areas, right? Like laden with minefields. And then how do you square that? Because a lot of fans have to do that dance.
When it comes to fandom, there's so much in our lives that we cheer for and that we love, and that is so complicated and so fraught with so many issues, right? Like, if you're into fashion, if you think about where the clothes come from and who made them and all that, like, that sucks, right? Like, that's an awful thing to think about. But when you think about the beauty of fashion, when you think about like the end products and the stories that you can tell with different fashions, that's really powerful for a lot of people, right? So I think that, sports is similar for me in that there are a lot of stories that I think come out through sports. There are a lot of the good and the bad is all part of it, right? Like we're sort of like I'm a contradiction in a lot of ways, and I think I'm just like everybody else.
So a great way to end this conversation about your love for the sport and its complications and the way these things come together is, how do then you feel as a person who values sports and is an advocate for women, the emergence at the local level at these high school teams of women playing on football teams? How do you feel about that? How do you respond to that? What do you think that is a part of the future of football?
I do. The NFL recognizes that the majority of its, or not the majority, but close to the majority, close to at least half of their fans are women. And I think right now you're having the cultural conversation around like, how do we cater to these female fans? I think the terms of inclusion would have to be much, much different. I think that would really fuck with gender in a way that a lot of people are not prepared to deal with.
Well, it's funny because in what you just talked about, in so many ways, you're not an anomaly of football. You're actually the future of football, right?
Ooh, I'll take that.
Ways,
yeah.
right? You represent the future of where football has to go and what it's got to do if it wants to stick around. You'll take it.
I'll take it.
Well, and with that, having given it, thank you so much for joining us and for talking about the way in which your passion for football fuses and runs across your life and into what you do. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It was fun.
You're welcome.